Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to the live stream. This week, we're going to be talking about greedflation. We don't got a guest. We've got Steve, we've got Mike, we've got Ty, we've got Dave. It's going to be fun. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
It's a new year, and we are only weeks away from the inauguration of President Small Hands. Oops. Did I say President Small Hands? You know what they say about men with small hands? Small gloves. It's great to have you all back, and it's time for another season of Steve Keen and Friends. Best £12.50 I've ever spent, I think. New year, same old economics. It could be that 2025 turns out to be an interesting year and not in a good way. But meanwhile, let's dig into something that's been lighting up headlines and dinner table conversations since the pandemic. Greedflation. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term, but just so we're all on the same page, it's the idea that companies are jacking up prices way beyond what they need to, using inflation as a convenient excuse to rake in extra profits. Sounds like a scandal, right? But let's ask the bigger question. Is this a new phenomenon? Or another question, is it just a regular part of the business cycle that was amped up by the cover of a pandemic? And perhaps more importantly, is there anything we can actually do about it? Here's an observation worth unpacking. Recent studies like those from the Economic Policy Institute reveal that during the inflation surge of 21-22, a huge 54% of price increases came from corporate profits, while labor costs contributed only about 8%. Historically, it's been the other way around. Rising wages or material costs would squeeze profits, not expand them. Take the energy sector, for example. In 2022, companies like ExxonMobil reported their highest profits in decades. Meanwhile, you and I are paying sky-high prices at the pump. Did their costs jump that much? Not really. What we're seeing is companies and industries with little competition leveraging their pricing power, with us footing the bill. This isn't just about pointing fingers, though, which might feel good, but can't on its own solve a system problem. It's about asking, is this an ever-present feature of how market economies work? I'm here to learn, but full transparency. My current thinking is that it's always existed, but has been culturally supercharged by neoliberalism. So let's see where I stand at the end of this live stream. Get your questions firing in the chat. You already are. And let's tackle this head on, because if there's one thing we know, economics is never as simple as the headlines make it seem like it is. All right, let's get started. Ty Keynes, come on down. Where's my Ty Keynes? There he is.
Well, Price
All
is right here.
Yeah.
All
Yeah, there
right.
we go.
Yeah.
We couldn't decide who was going to be playing the applause, so I'm just jumping in, that's what we do here. It's carnage.
Yeah.
I can't believe you only just met Steve and I think Dan for the first time in real life over the Christmas break.
Well, I've met Dan over the last couple of years many times because
Right.
we live very close together.
Right,
But
okay.
yeah, first time for Steve. I
Was there
saved him.
anything you noticed about Steve in real life that's different from Steve online? I mean, is he a different person?
Actually,
Taller?
no.
Is he not taller than you think? He's like 6'7" or something.
No, no height difference. That's the one thing I was expecting. But honestly, it was kind of an interesting social experiment because it's been 3 years now that Steve and I have been in constant contact and doing this live stream. So there was enough contact where I felt like I knew him very personally anyway. So when he came, it was a natural fit. When
That's
you have
cool.
a stranger in your house, and so you're kind of a different person. Maybe you got the mask on. Not
Yeah.
with Steve.
You didn't
Not
feel on
with
best
Steve.
behavior or anything.
Yeah, the hockey game was on. 2 hours. He was in the house. We were watching a hockey game. So it was good. It was good
That's
to have
cool.
him.
Yeah, I had the same when Steve and I had a beer or two and maybe a cheeky whiskey at the in London in the summer. That was good. So no, it is always good to meet in real life as opposed to this version of life. I'm not sure what this version is. Should we get who should we get on? Let's get Mike in here. Where's Mike? Is he in the house? Here he is. I'm doing something. Good to have you, man.
Good to be here.
Now, how is
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you. You've been cleaning up New Year, speaking of which, and Christmas and getting all down. You were telling us before you weren't going for a dump where you were confused. You were at the dump.
Yeah, or more formally, the recycling center. All the Christmas cardboard and styrofoam and whatever. Took a trailer load. So, yeah. The styrofoam I hate. That and glitter. I don't know where the hell it goes when you get rid of it, but it's just awful.
It goes to form a layer that archaeologists will dig up in a million years and go, what the hell was going on?
Yeah, or those damn packing peanuts. That's another one that gets me going.
There's going to be an absolute mystery for people to unearth that stuff in a million years. So if they're people, they're probably not. They'll probably be robots. But I digress. Should we get Steve in here as well? And let's start talking about greedflation. Here he is, Steve. Good to have you.
Hello.
Do you feel this is a totally new year? Do you feel refreshed, or you just feel like?
Same. Like my New Year greeting is Happy New Year. Brace for impact.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
That's the nature of the last 5 bloody years. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So yeah.
Now,
okay. In fact, yeah. Yes, Mike.
I say down here, we're waiting for noon on January 20th when we make Canada the 51st state.
Is it going to happen that quick?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Straight in the afternoon, straight back to the office, and boom.
I hear Denmark is making a takeover offer for America. They're willing to buy everything except its government, which has already been sold.
They're not calling it down here Greenland. They're calling it Orange Land after Trump.
I like that. That's good. That's good.
Well, at least everyone's got a sense of humor about it. I suppose there's that we can be grateful for. Should we do top chatters? Because I don't want to forget our
let's do that. Yeah.
Our lovely listeners. Okay. We do tend to leave it too late sometimes. So let's do this. Who's going to be up for the first time of the year? It's an honor to do the first one of the year. So I'm sure I'm going to get a volunteer. Deathly silence.
How about giving it to Ty, who's been hiding in the background for quite some time? Ty, come on, in the foreground.
With a new background, though.
We go. Ghost on the Half Shell, Kevin Mays, Process Server, Tony Wilson, Web Freaks Algorithm, The Herald of Change, Dregai, Santosh Bala, Blue Bay, Michael Newman. I've got the Santosh Bala twice. Congratulations. You are the first dual top chatter of 2025. No one, Philip Rule, Garen Osborne, Marie. That's a weird way to spell Marie. Marie. Tom Meow. Need to be regulated. HPB. Rick O'Brien. Sherry Wise. TR. Long Defiant. J Mills, our #1 troll chatter ever. Samir, Go To Guy, Steve Firth, John Watson, D. Bruce, Jack Fritwell, Young Visionary 1985. I am sorry, my friend. Millennials are not young anymore. Michael D'Souza Cruz, Kathleen Logan Smith, Joe Polito, Nicholas Gomez, Adam Childs, Bullet Quantum. I bet that's probably a bot for some financial firm. Michael Anthony, Anna Ringweld, Red Dot, BZ, Helen Greaves, David Collins, Paul Trainer, Ken Crawford.
Happy days. Do you reckon if we can see some comments from Bullet Quantum that look human in the comments immediately, we'll know for sure that's a real person? That would be nice to know. Steve, what was it like meeting Ty for the first time? Did he exceed expectations?
The one thing you often get told is shouldn't meet your heroes, because sometimes your heroes are assholes. And I don't have. I can think of somebody in particular. But let's not talk about randy people here. Let's talk about normal people. So Ty was great to meet. Ty was totally natural. Felt like we've been next door neighbours for the last 10 years rather than online colleagues for the last 2 or 3. But it was great.
So basically, he was
Very nice
taking
to be in
the
the
piss out
house.
of you right
Nice
from the
to meet your
start.
better half. Nice to meet your better half as well, and your better third, the dog. So it was very good, very enjoyable.
Excellent. And what goes on tour stays on tour. This is probably we've got the sanitized version.
Nothing untoward happened in Vancouver, unfortunately. It was all above board behaviour. Even down to having a Mexican at the restaurant you and Marie first met at. You had your first meal together. Is that right?
That's correct. It was a
very nostalgia tripping around there, which was cute. I had to concede that Vancouver's a fairly attractive town. Shitty harbour, but great mountains, which is the opposite of Sydney. Great harbour and no mountains whatsoever that you can see anyway. So it was a very nice little trip. Actually, I've seen all 3 of you in the last 6 months. I think that's about right.
Now you're going to see me Wednesday in London.
That's right. We're meeting up in London again. Yeah. We've got to get Ty over on this. This is doing energy modelling, which that was my next stop, was going down and seeing Kerry King in Austin. I'm doing my bit for global warming because I reckon we've lost the argument. Let's win the war. So, I'm calling in the backup team of reality. And now that we've lost the debate between the deniers and ourselves, the deniers have won that debate. So it's time to hand over to the backup team, which is reality. So I'm doing my bit to put some more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They reckon it'll help plants grow faster. I reckon it'll prove them wrong faster. So we'll see. So I did, the trip was off to Toronto for about 6 days to work with Matthias Griselli and Tim Garrett on a new extension to Tim's ideas about energy modelling, which was very good. Then caught up with Ty, and then down to Kerry, and then back over here again. And now I'm polluting the Northern Hemisphere once more, or the Northern European Hemisphere.
Very good.
Tony, no, mate. No, look, it's a great city. I do agree, but better than Sydney. At the moment, I'm suffering at -3 degrees or over in Amsterdam. I like my beach. I like a yellows. I'm in favour of a yellow Christmas. Okay.
Well, what about having everything? We're at Vancouver. You can ski in the afternoon after going for a surf in the morning, or something like that. That's the way it's been sold to me.
The one thing I regret is it was rainy, and in Vancouver it always rains in the winter. In the summer, with those mountains like in Mayish where there's still snow capped. But you've got the warmer weather, you're downtown Vancouver, sunny day. You can go take a lift up the mountain in 15 minutes. It's something special. So that's my only regret. You didn't see it on a sunny day. In the winter, yeah, you can't. I imagine Sydney, nice warm weather. How can you beat that aspect of it? So.
Yeah, that's true.
Ty, your mic apparently can come up a bit. We're getting sound advice from the chat, so that's nice. But yeah, so you could crank it up a bit.
Hold on here.
See if that works, and then we'll get Drig Eye to tell us if it sounds okay. It could be that maybe Drig Eye just turn your mic up a bit, maybe turn your audio up. No, I just turned mine up. It might be better now. Who knows? Who knows? Yeah. Very good. Well, let's dive into it, shall we? Ty, this is to some degree your baby. Obviously, I know Mike and Steve, you've got loads to say on this, but Ty, you've actually done some recent work on this, and you want to unpack it a bit. So where should we dive in? Greedflation in the pandemic, is that the focus that you had?
Yeah, so it was an accident, right? So it kind of building out my national model with applied MMT. We've done a run from 2020 until now, so we've seen a lot of events occur, right? And we've been able to kind of unpack a lot of data and look at the dynamics. And one of the first things we noticed, so in the model, got some proprietary things, but in the model, we have a few functions that dictate how firms mark up their prices, right? And we had to put those functions in there to actually have the model match reality to some degree. And what we kind of discovered is that, firm markups is a natural occurrence in all the business cycles. And so even if we go in before the dynamics and we just use our mental models, right, we look at the individual firm, and I try not to use microeconomics as in macro examples, but this is probably pretty important. Owning a small business, I know during good times, if my contracts permit it, I'm raising prices. That's the time where I take my profits because the market allows it. Whereas in leaner times, you're competing against other firms if you're in a crowded market space, or you're even not in so much of a crowded market space. You're now competing for the demand of the consumer. If that demand's not there, you can't really raise your prices. And that applies to the macro. We can see those dynamics in that. So that function was built in macro terms in the model. And so we kind of ran those tests over and over with different variations of shocks. And we had a really, probably one of the biggest production shocks since World War II. And in fact, It might have been worse in a lot of senses, because in World War II, we did a transition shock. So we moved industry into war production. Whereas this time we shut down, 15% of the economy, essentially 20% in some countries. It varies region to region. That created a huge, massive shock. And one of the first insights that we got out of the model is endogenously, we got that bump in inflation about a year later. Right, just an emergent property of the model. That was really cool. But we're able to kind of look at all the different sources and dynamics of that inflation. Now, our model's very aggregated, so we don't have industry to industry, but we can look at the productive firm sector, the banking sector, et cetera, et cetera. And in every cycle, we see a period where firms mark up prices. Now, in a normal business cycle, so let's say we run all the way through the 2010s, so after the great financial crisis to 2020, we went through two business cycles, essentially. Very hard to see in the data because they were just normalized cycles. But in those two cycles, we did see firm markups at a certain point in that business cycle. What was different, of course, with 2020, 2021, 2022, is we were going through a major shock of the pandemic. And so a lot of things got amplified during that period. And huge profits ensued, when the economy turned back on. So we have in our function, we believe in reality, this function exists, it's pretty much an exponential. So as profits go up, firms become, we'll use the word more ballsy with their pricing, right? And keep in mind, in a capitalist economy, that's what a firm's supposed to do, is make as much money as possible. That's a healthy capitalist economy. But as profits go into the extreme territory, right, you go up that exponential curve even more. And we get into that point of what's interpreted as greedflation. But that's a natural phenomenon of the way the capitalist system is set up. And so my thesis is there's not a whole lot we can do about it because, one, we're probably not going to, unless Steve's right about climate change, which he is, we probably won't have a shock like we saw in the pandemic anytime soon again, right? That's a once in 60, 70-year event. But because we saw that shock, we went into a kind of an extreme business cycle,
right? We saw the extreme inflation rate. We saw extreme unemployment to extreme employment. We saw extreme output, low output to extreme high output, right? We saw all those extremes, and we included with that, we saw the extremes of firms marking up their prices for a bit. Now, one thing we did discover in the model is the model didn't account for all the firm markups. So we had to actually put in shocks to shock it up even more. So I will agree with the argument that there are firms, probably monopolies and monosopody. What's the one where you're
single buy?
I always get that word mixed up in my head. There's no doubt there were those actors out there that could push the market whatever way they did wanted to do, collude it maybe with one other big corporation and mark prices up. That certainly occurred, but from a systemic standpoint, it was the way it was going to happen. It's kind of built into the system. And like I said, go back to that small example of the individual firm. Even if you're a small business, if you have an opportunity to raise your prices without driving away customers, that's what you do, right? The same thing that a wage earner, if they have an opportunity to get a higher wage, that's what they do. Right. That's part of our capitalist system. And so that's my thesis on greedflation. And so at this point in the game, there's not a whole lot in policy we can do because we're probably not going to encounter something so extreme in the near future.
And can I, before I come on to Steve, just one sec, and Mike. So is there a quick response to economics in one lesson there? What stops people from buying less or seeking out comparable products at lower prices? Is this a big cultural thing that we just can't change within capitalism with regulation or anything?
Well, that's a good that's a good question for Econ 101. Like, what does stop the American consumer from consuming? That's a good question.
Well, I mean, this is the question we're thinking in terms of aggregate terms versus the vision of a competitive market, and this is what we're getting out of that question. Now, see comparable products at lower prices. What we're looking at here is the macroeconomics of inflation, and that partly reflects the micro, which I want to come back to. But when you have if you look at how Koleski was the first person to really talk analytically about what causes markups to change, and he had no neoclassical baggage whatsoever. His basic logic was you can break the level of prices into three factors. It's the input cost you're looking at, which in this case we often look at wages as the input cost. It's the output per worker, so that's the output per input unit, and it's the markup. He broke it into those three. Now, neoclassicals never look at markups. One simple reason: they have this stuck in their heads. Intersecting curves, okay? And in their vision, you have a supply curve and a demand curve. Where the two meet is where prices are determined, and you can do nothing about it. And it's all actually in nominal terms, in real terms, not in nominal terms. So that vision says that price setting is out of the hands of the individual firm. Okay? The prices are set by the market itself. When you look in the real world, rather than having the rising, that depends upon an essential element of that is believing marginal cost rises. The more output you produce, the more inputs you need. You have a set of fixed inputs. You're putting more variable inputs against those fixed inputs, and even all the variable inputs you're adding are assumed to be of equal individual productivity. They're crowding themselves around the fixed inputs, the machinery, and you get less output per work out of that. That's what causes rising marginal cost. Now, that, to use a technical term, is complete and utter fucking bullshit. Okay? There have been 71 surveys that have contradicted that result. What you have instead is firms have constant variable costs per unit, and they then put a markup on that, and the markup reflects the level of competition they perceive that they face in getting sales. And if you have a period where there's a high level of monetary demand, and we did have that courtesy of the fiscal stimulus during COVID, then what the manufacturers see is their goods are going out the warehouse at really high speed. A bit like what Ty was talking about beforehand. In that situation, you don't perceive a lot of competitive pressure, so you feel like you can put your markup up, and that seems to be what happens. So what I've when I do my modeling and I include a price dynamic, I normally have variable wages, but I had a fixed markup in the model, not because I believe it's fixed, but because I couldn't work out a way to logically model it. And what I like what you did, Ty, with your national model is what you was basically arguing a moment ago. You said that markups rise when economic conditions are good. So everybody feels that it's easy to sell. There's lots of demand. I can put my markup up, and I think that makes sense. And you've got that to fit the data fair.
Yeah, so it's essentially it's the shape of an exponential. So because in extreme situations, it looks like firms are extremely greedy, and of course that's a subjective term. But so in a time like after the pandemic, yeah, we went up that slope quite high, right? And so there was there was very high markups. Now, that for me, because this discussion is a dynamic one, it's temporal going through time. I then ask, because we're going through time and we're not going to see something like this anytime soon again, is it really something we need to keep addressing in the media? Because I have a feeling the media gets a hold of something, left or right, and they run with it, and it's taken out of context, right? Bottom
They've got advertising to sell. They need eyeballs.
We have chosen a capitalist system, and part of a healthy capitalist system, with all its ills, is that firms can make a profit, and they make a profit in a temporal time that's appropriate to have a smooth business cycle, you can say, even though the pandemic was obviously a series of serious shocks.
And so if I can pinch from Economics 101's follow-up question, which I think you've answered, but I just want to clarify, is, if it would seem then that they could do that at will anytime, but they seem to do it, like you say, in these run-ups and these exuberant periods where it seems possible to do it and get away with it kind of thing. Is that a fair way of looking at it? As to why it doesn't happen all the time? It doesn't seem possible that it can happen all the time, I suppose, from what you're saying.
It can't in aggregate, and Steve will know this, is because there is a share of income in the economy. So there is a period where wages are actually, so the wage earner is sort of winning that epic battle between capitalists and wage earners, right? We'll go to Marx here. So during that period, profits are a little bit lower. And I know this is counterintuitive. You think the firm wants to mark up, right? But the time where wages are going up, bank accounts haven't gone up at the same time. And there's that temporal leg, a first order leg. Wages go up. The stock of people's income has to go up, and then there's some sort of time constant where they spend that income, right? So there's a temporal lag that has to be accounted for. So while wages are going up, the bank accounts aren't as high, so there's no consumption yet. And at the same time, firms are like, oh, there's no consumption, so there must be no demand. I don't dare mark up prices, right? So there are periods during the business cycle where the firms in aggregate cannot perform that action, right? Whether it's because individual managers of firms and factories kind of see that demand and they're like, oh, I don't want to lose business, right? Any number of reasons like that. So there are periods where it just dynamically can't happen. If that kind of answers the question.
Mike, can I bring you in here, and maybe you can help with this question as we go. But would a lot of that be accounted for by oligopolies? Because Ty's model is looking at, the aggregate, the whole thing. It's not going to get micro. But there's oligopolies that are maybe dragging up that average more easily, because in that situation, it's easier for them to take advantage of that sort of situation. Or am I talking out my ass? Let me know.
I think, one of the questions if I'm on an airplane and the guy next to me says, what do you do? And I say, I'm an economist, they either turn away and look out the window, or they ask me, what's the stock market going to do? To which I answer, if I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would be on my private jet. Or what are interest rates going to do? I want to refinance my house. That's the most common questions. Most recently, though, I've been getting, What causes inflation? Jesus Christ, my grocery bill is through the ceiling and whatever. And I always say any question in economics can be answered with it depends, or it depends on the elasticities, right? So we had a question, an Econ 101 question about the price elasticity of substitution. Why don't you just substitute away? How sensitive, is your demand for a good with respect to price? So it depends. So a lot of what I'm hearing here from my esteemed colleagues, I don't disagree with, but it's a little bit all over the place. I think it's hard for folks to follow. I have a model that I use to teach about inflation. If you want to see it, I'll show you how system dynamicists handle this if you want to, but I don't want to start a lecture here. But yes, market power is one aspect of the argument, and I'll go much deeper if you want me to.
Well, I think deeper. What do you think, Steve? First of all, you might want to respond to that being, to your response being all over the place. I'm sure.
I think
both where I come from.
Ty and Steve, I think it's hard. There's a lot of hand waving, a lot of factors here, but it's a little hard to follow. I mean, I kind of followed it, but I think the audience might not.
Yeah, I was going to share something on my screen and I just lost the tab, which is really great at me. I'm trying to re-find it again. I might actually just reload the file. But
then while you're finding that, Ty, can I ask that oligopolies question, because you're looking at such big averages and you can't look at the micro, what is your instinct that monopoly behavior can and does have anything to do with this, with greedflation, because they have the power more than others, more than a decentralized part of the market that's much smaller, be able to take control?
It absolutely can. So it depends on what the demand is for. So if there's a demand in a product that is run by a monopoly, that's going to have a different effect, but that's changing all the time. So when I'm modeling an aggregate, I have, thousands of parameters that are adjusted to kind of, for instance, if we look at the composition of capital, I'm using this as an example to try to conquer having aggregation and not having that nuance, right? I can look at the nominal stock of fixed capital in the U.S., and this chat just keeps on popping up. It's driving me nuts. The nominal capital in the U.S., so machines and factory, everything that's factored in, you can find it on Fred, right? And then I look at nominal output, I can get a capital output ratio. That tells me in aggregate how productive the economy is. I'm not looking at each individual firm or anything, but I can get a market of a mixed bag, essentially, right? Where every widget is essentially been combined into one widget, and that widget's productivity will change, and I use a capital output ratio. So that's how I do things in aggregate, right? I have parameters or constants that represent things that are mixed together, and those parameters and constants, if the model gets more detailed, can become dynamic themselves to account for different combinations of, let's say, capital and stuff of the sorts.
Okay, Steve, you've got something ready to go up on screen and talk about?
Ready to share, so whack it up if you wouldn't mind. It's okay. And I might go for full screen on that if I shut the shutdown. Okay, what I've got there, this is taking Koleski's arguments about how prices are set and applying it to American data over the last 70 years. And I'm sorry the lines are so faint. There's a bug in Ravel right now where I can't actually change pen settings. The black line is the rate of inflation. The green line is the rate of change of money wages. The red line is the rate of change of firm markups. And the blue line is the rate of change of labor productivity. Now, when you look at it, and this is just something which I've just sort of eyeballed, but it makes sense to me. Notice how between 1958 and about 1980, the green line is often above the red line, or above the black line. In other words, wage change is higher than the overall rate of inflation. So in that stage, you could say wages were the main pressure pushing up prices. The blue line subtracts from inflation. That's why I've got it as a negative there, because more units of output per worker means a lower change in the rate in the price per unit. The red line is the markups, and you can see markups were generally below the rate of inflation and bouncing around pretty much around, not around, just slightly above the zero level over time until 1990. And then from that point forward, you're seeing more often the red line above the black line. So markups have more impact. I think what that tells us is a story about union power and the crushing of unions under neoliberalism, which began in the 1970s. And from that point on, you've crushed the capacity of workers to get money wage rises. So most of the time we're going to get inflation is because firms have got more muscle power to put up prices than workers have to put up their wages. So this is fundamentally seeing inflation as a struggle over the distribution of income. And by weakening workers, and just almost destroying trade unions, workers don't have the bargaining power anymore. They only get a chance to put up wages when the firms themselves are doing it, because full employment implies are pretty close to full employment, and they're trying to drag in more workers by putting up wages. So you can see that potentially happening under the pandemic, that initially there was a collapse in employment, then all the stimulus we had, first of all, meant you had a high level of employment. It also meant you had a high level of monetary demand. So firms felt more able to put their prices up. And you can see that across if I just move my mouse, I hope you can see my mouse here. This period here is where markups definitely dominate. So you're trying to explain the inflation that happened under COVID, it's markups. And that's the point that Isabella Weber makes. And you also get that out of Blair Fix as well. Back here, it was workers and trade unions. So this is actually not just a story about inflation, it's also a story about changing power. And over the last 50 years, the power has gone from the trade union movement to the manufacturers.
And Ty, I think you've probably got something to add to that, haven't you? Because you're looking at it from the recent, you're modeling basically over the pandemic, but you'd be able to model that, or you'd have an instinct of what.
Well, Steve's actually modeled that. If you look, if you look at most of Steve's model, one of the glaring points he does in his model, aside from the financial instability we see, is he charts the wage share and the firm share and the financial share of income, and it's an emergent property of his model where the wage share is declining, right? So his model,
the rising levels of private debt cause a lower wages share. Yeah, definitely. Yes. That's another factor that's not included in classical decomposition, of course, but it's part of the underlying emergent properties.
Exactly. It actually might be really a baseline catalyst, right? So that phenomenon is in itself it's a negative reinforcing loop where it's destroying trade unions, et cetera, right? So it might be a really underlying situation.
I guess what I'm...
Hold on. Did our chat get so bad and negative that Julia's taken it down? Okay, there it is.
Okay.
I guess what I mean, Ty, is the way I understood you are setting this up, there's a business cycle side to this, which is this is how capitalism works. And I guess Steve's saying is there's an element of union degradation that means that when you get shocks, like the pandemic, that you can get greedflation. Or am I missing something, a part of the puzzle here?
You're not missing anything. So there's obviously a long-term systemic issue in capitalism that both Steve and I agree on, which is a declining wage share. And I post that on Twitter X. The one metric I'm really looking at, it's not GDP, it's the wage share, right? That's really, the wage share is always going to oscillate up and down with the business cycle, but that long-term decline is problematic. Yeah. But what I'm saying is that firms marking up prices is a phenomenon of each business cycle. That's part of the system itself. And that's never going away. But when we see an extreme shock like the pandemic, we're going to see an extreme greedflation, if we want to. We're going to see that. But going forward, this isn't going to be a constant thing going forward. Eventually, the business cycle has to turn. Wage earners will start getting the upper hand again, even though over time, that upper hand's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Greedflation isn't a constant that we are going to see, right? Greedflation was a result of the extreme shocks we saw during the pandemic. And it happens, greedflation, to a small degree in every business cycle. That's how a firm runs, and that will never change unless we go to a new economic system, whatever that may be.
And Mike, is there anything you can add to that? I love the way you describe differently, basically the same things that Steve and Ty often talk about, and I'd love to hear how you see that these things settle down.
Well, would you want to see my model of how this stuff works?
No,
bring it up. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, okay, you can. But here's what my question was.
We're model infatuated.
I guess why greedflation doesn't stick around. Ty's just given us a version of that.
Well,
but I wanted to hear from you.
There's a lot of factors that go into it, to pricing. It's the drive for profit and make your quarterly numbers and all that stuff is certainly there, but there are other factors as well. So it's on net with all these different pressures influencing the markup in the sectors where there's price makers instead of price takers. So what's the cause? There can be lots of different shocks that initiate an inflation, and then all sorts of feedback loops kick in. So now you're trying to do feedback loop dominance, loop gains, to see which loops are contributing what to the dynamics of inflation. So it's quite simplistic to just say it's this or it's that, in my opinion, whether it's the media or whatever. Oh, it's due to this. Well, there's a lot going on.
I guess the politics comes in at the point where people are taking what is thrown out as the story about how it's caused and running with that. And that feeds back into the system too. There's no escaping that. So Ty, you hinted at this, and I wanted to go into this a bit more if we can, is where does the perception of greedflation play into the whole system, and how does it feed back and either make it worse or solve it? Does that play any part? Well, I think it did in the election.
So yeah, my thesis is it's the 24-hour news cycle, right? And it doesn't just apply to greedflation. It applies to a lot of issues that get pumped way up and get distorted, right? So on the left, there's been a pump up of greedflation. Don't get me wrong. It is a phenomenon that we need to discuss and understand because it's part of the economic system, and we're all here for economics. So don't get me wrong on that. But when you involve the media, you don't get the proper nuance. You get scare tactics, right? And so that, to me, is one of the biggest drivers of this story is actually the media coverage in itself. And I know a lot of people on the left are going to be like, well, we're not getting coverage. We've got a Republican in power, et cetera, et cetera. The left is 50% in a country like the United States. It is getting coverage on MSBC, whatever it is. Mike, you know the name, MSNBC. What? Yeah.
Microsoft NBC.
Yeah, it does
that's where it came from. Yeah.
It does get coverage, but it gets amped up, right? And we lose the nuance and the deep discussion, the rich discussion that we are having right now, whether we agree or not. You don't get that in the 24-hour news cycle to really break down all the different aspects. As Mike was saying, there's so much that goes into it. So that for me is the big issue.
But I think the stuff like just that little collecting and breakdown I showed earlier, to me, the reason we're seeing greedflation being talked about now is that it is markups that contributed to the inflation during the COVID period. There was a small period where there were money wages. Actually, taking a look at it again throughout the whole pandemic, money wage increases have been lower than the rate of inflation. And what that means is, of course, workers are getting less buying power. Okay, so if you look back in the 1970s, and the thing about the Volcker, interest rates rises at that time, that was to break the back of the trade unions, and everybody's blaming trade unions for the increase in prices and inflation at the time. And fundamentally, when you do the decomposition, it's right. Okay, wages were rising substantially. I was actually involved in the Australian trade union movement at the time through the Australian Metalworkers Union. I wasn't an employee, but I was working intensively with their leading research officer. And I had a heavy conversation with a guy called Laurie Carmichael as well, who was the sort of titular head of the union. And they basically said that we saw all the wage rises we managed to get through negotiation with high employment levels back in the early 70s, completely eroded by inflation. And that's one reason they went for wage setting in Australia went away from being just get extra money wages to get negotiating over superannuation and things like that. So pay rises were traded off against increased amounts of money in your pension fund fundamentally. But you look at the data, and clearly in the 60s and 70s, it was the power of trade unions being able to negotiate higher wages that dominated inflation. They've now been broken, and what we're looking at now, it's the power of firms to put up markups that gives us the inflation. So that's we've got to stand in the middle here. That's the reason that we see greedflation being talked about now, because workers know it's not them.
So I'm hesitant to say what can we do about it, because Ty, you're saying this is all part of the business cycle. If unless we're going to change the entire system, in which case it's too complex to talk about. Certainly not in the 2 hours we've got. But what are the factors? So if we just say, right, well, we need unions back, or what are some of the main factors that we could, or are we in a different type of world now where unions on their own wouldn't be enough of influence? I don't know. What are the things that we could be looking at better, or we should be having conversations about to solve this? Or is it just we're stuck with it? It's always going to happen with big shocks like a pandemic.
I'll chime in that 100% we need trade unions again. Like if I look at the Canadian data, it's devastating, right? So that would be a huge factor that we have. So trade unions are an aggregate power for the worker, right? To represent them. They're like the lawyers for the worker, right? And so it's not going to solve everything, but it's going to fight to keep the proportion of the wage share up a bit. So that would be the one and only thing that I would suggest we need to address. Anything where it comes along to price caps of certain industries, when this event only happens once every 50, 60 years, how do you have a government that has a bureaucracy to decide, okay, which industry needs a temporary price cap? What product is really necessary for that? How do you do that in the moment of a crisis? I don't think it can be done, and I think it would actually be more destructive and disruptive in that moment than actually doing any good. So I'm not in favor for something like that. And as for the government and any institutions right now spending too much time on this issue, well, how do we do it? That's a resource drain in itself for something that's probably not going to happen for a little while. And if it does happen again, it happens again. That's kind of my opinion. It's heartless. So I would go back trade unions. That's where I stand. That is the ultimate thing that can counterbalance huge monopoly corporations.
So a couple of comments.
Go, Mike, sorry. No, go, Mike. Sorry.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, okay. A couple comments. One is the United States did try wage and price controls in the early 1970s. President Nixon. They were in two phases. The first phase, it was against the law to raise wages and prices. And then that wasn't working. There were workarounds. Okay, I can't raise your salary. I'll give you a company car. You can eat your meals free at work. I'll double your vacation. So they worked around it. So then the second phase, it became just unpatriotic to raise wages and prices. And that wasn't really working either. So they just abandoned it. So the idea that a government can control all that, World War II, they try. I mean, it's been tried, but it's quite awkward and whatever. On the matter of collective bargaining and trade unionism, the guy who taught me labor economics, pretty eminent guy in the field, had a model of ability to pay, ability to make pay that we were taught. Yeah. It was just sort of case studies. I've modeled it formally. But he said, if you're a strong union, you have, but you don't have the ability for whatever reason for the company can't pay. You're strong, lots of union members, but they can't make the company pay because they can't for whatever competitive reasons or whatever. No good. If you had a company that could pay, they have some sort of monopoly power, a moat, network effects, patents, whatever, but you can't make them pay. Again, no good. So you need ability to pay, ability to make pay to get a good trade unionism outcome. And of course, if the unions are making demands, but they can't make the company pay, maybe the company can't pay or whatever the circumstances are, then trade unionism falls off. People say, why am I going to pay dues? I'm not getting anything for it. So and there's a lot of dynamics that influence ability to pay, ability to make pay, right? So it's quite a complicated dynamic process, I think.
We actually did talk about the world wars as well, by the way, on this front, because we have, if you look at what the pandemic did, one major thing was a dramatic increase in government spending. Deficit running at about 20% of GDP. That's only ever been matched by World War I and World War II, or exceeded by those two world wars. If you look about World War I, there was massive inflation in America, and that the bureaucratic memory of that continued, unlike what happens today, because we had decent bureaucracies back in those days. And when the World War II hit, they immediately set up price controls. As you know, J.K. Galbraith was involved in those, one of our non-orthodox economic heroes. And when you look at the level of, just to have a go at the money causes inflation argument, which I'm sure we're going to get at some point, or the Austrians watching this will pipe up with at some point. The level of money creation during World War I was about half the level of money creation during World War II. The level of inflation during World War I was twice the level of inflation during World War II. So it showed the price controls, the rationing, everything else during World War II did stop the extremely high demand for labor and the shortages of goods under rationing. It stopped that leading to inflation. So they can work on those extreme situations, price controls like that. You can have an entire economy always on price controls. I doubt it. Okay, but under duress, as we had in World War I and World War II, bringing in the price controls meant the increase in money didn't go through to consumer goods; it went through to industrial production of war materials, which is what was required. So World War II was a successful example of saying we want to direct as much of the money creation as we can towards the armaments effort. We therefore want people not to want money wage rises during the time. We don't want firms charging higher prices either. That was all negotiated effectively, with J.K. Galbraith playing a major role. And we didn't have substantial inflation in World War II, whereas that did happen in World War I.
Is there ever an argument for the opposite of that? If we think that we can't control inflation, can we create circumstances where there's more likely to be deflation? And the reason I'm asking this is that the main argument that seemed to emerge from the US election was that people didn't want a little bit of disinflation. Don't even know what that meant. People seem to want prices back to 2019, prices, not inflation levels. So I wondered if we could comment on what you think in the modeling you've seen about what happens if you try to target, not saying that we do, but try to target deflation. Why isn't that a target, basically? And why is that not desirable?
Well, other than another Great Depression.
Yeah, so, I know, exactly. Right. But there's the perception out there that a bit of deflation would be good. You hear the Bitcoiner type people, libertarians, who are like, it'll hurt for a bit, but that's the best thing. We need to just get prices right down to minus whatever. And it's just like crazy talk as far as I'm concerned, but I want to know what you guys think.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was going to say, inflation and deflation both aren't particular problems until they become expected. And once they're expected, people change their behavior. Now, central banks around the world have a target of inflation of 2%, right? For the PCE in the US, the core, removing energy and food. Why isn't it zero? Because zero is perilously close to negative prices, and they don't want a deflationary spiral to start. Because why would I buy anything today if I expect it to be cheaper tomorrow? Why would I lend to anybody if I'm going to be paid back in cheaper dollars and what have you? So it really can start a death spiral. So central banks don't want anything near that. You can mathematically have a zero rate of inflation, but in the real world, no, too close for comfort.
And one of the dangers of deflation is amplifying private debt levels, and that was Irving Fisher's main argument against. That's why I said the Great Depression was great. First of all, of course, too high level of private debt to begin with, and then deflation, prices falling as a result. So what you had actually from 1930 to 32, 33 was the level of private debt in America was falling in aggregate dollar terms, whereas the debt to GDP ratio was rising at the same time because GDP was falling twice as fast as the level of debt was being paid down. So you don't want to get trapped into debt deflation. And that 2% target, that's one of those arbitrary things that came out of a neoclassical looking at what central banks do and saying that's what they tend to target. Central banks are completely ignorant about private debt. They just don't, they've got this up by neoclassical economists. They don't understand the role of private debt at all. So they ignore that particular danger. 2% is probably too close for comfort. I'd rather see be targeting at the order of about a 3% rate of inflation. And what that does in some ways is it makes up for the fact that money doesn't depreciate. Money, the monetary if you look at everything else degrades. The law of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. The monetary system tries to avoid that and tries to appreciate. Okay? Now, when you have inflation, that effectively is a form of demurrage. It's reducing the value of the money. It means it does deteriorate like everything else does, and it also means that you have an encouragement to buy, because the opposite of what Mike was saying a moment ago, rather than saying, why should I buy now? It's going to be cheaper tomorrow. You're more likely to buy because it'll be more expensive tomorrow. So it gets a way in which it maintains a level of consumption. So you do need to have a level of inflation in a growing capitalist economy. Now we're going into a shrinking capitalist economy. It's a whole new ball game.
Well, don't stop there.
Well, I mean, this is my. I'm going to be asked about this point. How would the monetary system operate if we're having degrowth? And that's sort of a bit broader than what we're talking about here today. Maybe that's the conversation for another show. But like, I think that's the main danger we face now, is that we have two choices for degrowth: voluntarily, or the climate does it to us. I saw a couple of climate deniers in the contact there. Sorry, guys, you're not going to like this argument. When climate change starts destroying our productive resources, we need a monetary system that will survive that. And there's no way the private monetary system will. So while we're currently in a mixed credit fiat economy where credit absolutely dominates, and we've got all the Bitcoin junkies who want to have a commodity, what they think is a commodity version of money that's not subject to depreciation. They want their money to appreciate. All those bets are off, and we start suffering from degrowth either voluntarily or compulsorily. And in that situation, only fiat money is going to have a chance of surviving. Apart from that, the next more money you're going to need is lead, not gold.
And Dave has dropped out, so
he must have been hit by some lead.
He must got hit by some lead. Another factor too, when it comes to deflation, as a small business owner, I'm trying to picture, if prices are going down but my wages are sticky, nobody wants their wage. How do you deal with that? And has everybody disappeared now? Oh, okay. You've put them in the lower corner. What have you done, Julia? Julia is our great engineer in the background. We should give her some credit. She's always back there pressing buttons. We love her a lot. She does a great job. I always tease her though. I shouldn't.
She's experimenting.
Yeah,
she's experimenting. This is a new year. She's allowed to try something out new. Yeah. This is the hangover cure for the day after party.
Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, no, that's another factor for me when I think about, like Steve was saying, in a growing economy, how do you have lower prices without having a depression, essentially? So we can lower prices, guys. We just, like the Austrians say, there's going to be some hurt, right? So yeah. Where did Dave go? I feel really naked without him now. It feels like where are you, Dave? What happened to you?
The trouble is in the UK with unreliable internet service. So it'll take him a while to get himself reset up again. Yeah. But what's your model predicting for inflation, Ty? Your national model. What is it saying for the future?
For the coming year, we're just going to be slightly elevated above 2%, going through all of 2025. Obviously all things equal, and there's no global wars or an asteroid hits. We should always nuance that. So 2025 looks like a relatively stable year. And obviously we have not modeled in Trump tariffs or anything like that, because we can run those scenarios, but our forecast is based off what is accumulated in stocks as of now, not what we think's going to happen in the future. So right now it looks like a good year for growth. I think growth in our model throughout the year is around 2.5% per annum. Employment will rise in the first part of 2025 and then actually decline in the second half of 2025. Again, nuancing that so many things can happen over the 6 months where that changes. In 2026, we do see a bit of a pop in GDP. Some people in my little organization are likening it to some sort of an echo pop, but I don't like that terminology. I don't like looking at the 1970s and the 1980s and say there's a thing going around. You'll see it a lot on Twitter about the risk of this echo inflation or echo pop in GDP. That was caused in the 80s and the 70s by certain exogenous situations, i.e. any energy crisis. It's not necessarily a feature of the system, but Steve would know that in a dynamic model, if you create some instability in your system, you'll go into a period of up and down oscillations, right? That could be interpreted as echo booms or whatnot, but so basically the nuance for the financial world, 2025 is going to be great. For the common worker, it's just more of the same, not much better.
And that's one thing which I got a chance to take a bit of a look at when I was with you over there, like the national model. And I'd actually like to have a bit of give it a bit of background on it, because what you've done, you've taken a model which was a conceptual model, really, based on my theories, but with made up parameters, and you've managed to fit it to the data using Python and AI. And that is something I think that's a remarkable. What you've done, you've gone in one leap. They talk about a great leap forward from a conceptual model with no real empirical foundation to it, to an empirical model. And Tony, we do model energy, empirical model, which actually fits the data fairly effectively. And how are you doing in terms of performing against the Treasury and the Central and the Federal Reserve's DSGE models?
Oh, we outperform them on a monthly basis all the time.
So
in the short run, we've got our parameters calibrated to such a degree that it is highly predictive. Now, as both you and Mike would know, complex systems are very sensitive to initial conditions. So when we go a year out, our model, as George Box would say, all models are wrong, but some are insightful, and we'll leave it at that. The further you go out, the cone of uncertainty becomes quite large in a complex system, right? You're off by 0.001. That's going to translate down the lower end system, right? That's what it is. But in the short term, we've calibrated it really well, and the biggest pride I have in this model is essentially no mainstream model predicted inflation in 2022 when you look back at their runs, right? And then as we were going through inflation, this was the top, and then their straight line would, inflation's going to go back down to its 2% target, and then the next update in that series, inflation went up even higher, and then they drew their little line saying, it's going to return back to its normal trend, right? And when we started running the simulation from 2020 forward, and freely admit it, this is all back testing, when we started putting in the shocks that we thought occurred during the lockdowns, our model generated that endogenous behavior, the full peak of inflation, and then coming back down the other side. So this is why I love system dynamics, and I know you two like it, is those emergent properties that you don't expect to see. If you've got a well-structured model and you think it's correct to reality, and keep in mind, George Box said all models are wrong, but some are insightful. Yeah. I think I have a really insightful model that is structured pretty well to a normal capitalist economy, and can hit things on the money. So it's it's worked out well. But really, the credit goes to a lot of your initial work, goes to Richard Goodwin, right? It goes to the works
definitely.
of Hyman Minsky. It goes right back to Marx and the class struggle, right? That's what the core of that model is, still that class struggle between workers and capitalists, although I've added many other sectors that counterbalance things. It still goes back to Irvin Fisher's debt deflation, although I have bankruptcies in my model, so that's kind of counteracts, the ultimate breakdown, but that's still in the DNA of that model. It still has that long-term aggregate feel of how a capitalist society works. We've just tuned it really well to look at 6-month chunks, and our goal is to just keep this money model running, right? So in system dynamics, your information comes from your stocks, right? And those stocks change over time, right? So we don't want to just restart the model and start with different initial conditions of the stocks. We want to keep the conditions of those stocks running through time and see how long we can go. The ultimate goal is to get AI, deep learning, to just take over this process completely, whether it's learning from me right now where I'm introducing the shocks, or it actually is smart enough to learn itself and input the shocks based on boundaries that we say you can change these parameters only. That's the ultimate next step, where we completely automate this, and we have a complex system that is having shocks introduced to it, but not subjectively by a human being, but by deep learning based on what it learns over time. That'll be really the revolutionary step for our model. And it's extremely hard, because as much credit as we give to AI, ultimately it only knows as much as we know. It just can process it all faster, right? So just because it can do all these things really fast, if it's getting the wrong information, it'll give you the wrong answer, and it won't be very insightful at all. So it's all about training a deep learning model that's living in the world of reality, and then can introduce the shocks to the model as we're going through real time. It's looking at the data. Okay, clearly something's happening here. I know it's this variable here that represents a certain shock in the economy. And another thing too is this goes beyond just, okay, here's a system dynamic model, and we're looking, what emergent properties are we looking for? It's gone beyond that, and I know system dynamicists out there would get leery of me saying we can do a quantitative national model, but I think we can, but that's what we're doing right now, and our predictions so far through 6 months are holding true. And I think AI can ultimately, a deep learning model can take over that process, and it'll be revolutionary. I don't mean to pump up my own tires, but Doug and I have got it going on right now.
I think you've done a brilliant job. I mean, you have every right to pump yourself up on that front, because, to go from the conceptual stuff, the toy models that I build, to the effective predictive model you've built out of collating my toy models is quite remarkable. So I want to get. I think it's about time you wrote some academic papers, my friend.
Yeah, so I have, a large kind of white paper for the model. And I've thought about, taking extracts out of it and maybe trying a small journal like the System Dynamic Journal, although they have they do have a rigorous process to get an article in. I've thought about it, but it takes a lot of work, and I'm not that good. I'm not as smart as Mike or yourself in that department.
Sorry, you haven't got the habitual hang-ups, Mike, and I've got in that department.
It's not that you're not as smart. You're not a trained academic. You got to write a paper for other eggheads a certain way. So it's just a matter of experience with the academic.
That's all it is. By the way, just a little detail for you, mate. My first master's thesis was failed. Okay, and deservedly so. Little long story, a little bit of an anecdote here. I didn't go back to university to do my master's until I was 34, I think. And I got a supervisor who was a lovely bloke, but he was a neoclassical. I didn't know what that meant at the time, or a new Keynesian, pardon me. And he got me to write for his audience while not understanding what I was writing, and it got failed, and just deservedly so. I then got what it was, combining my stuff on Marx, but at a light level, with arguments about what's called sage principle, but also on a light level. And I then got another supervisor. I just met another guy during that year in my university, who clearly had more smarts than my first supervisor, and basically gave me my head. I threw out the new Keynesian stuff that the first guy got me to do, did an extremely deep dive into Marx. I read everything Marx ever wrote on economics for my second to go at the masters. And of course, that led to the beginning of my academic career. So you can start off not knowing what to do. What you need is feedback from characters like me and Mike to say, have you written this in a way that'll, provide that, get the info across without being too pompous, because the first time we tried to write stuff, you thought you had to use big words. No, you have to communicate your ideas effectively. So we'll help you get there. But I think what you've done with the what do you call the DDNE? Dynamic disequilibrium.
Okay. So hold on. I went through about 15 different names for this model. It's no longer that. But I was at one point, I was like, you know what? I'd love to have the next, DSGE. I would like to have the next acronym. And I think that one there was
Dynamic disequilibrium.
Dynamic disequilibrium. Non-linear. I can't remember. I had so many names, and so now the model, because it's kind of gone to applied MMT, it's just a deep learning 2. We even dropped the messy because it was confusing too many of the clients on what messy really was.
Okay.
Yeah, so we've dropped that. Maybe one day as we grow bigger, we'll make that a proprietary like engine name, engine run by Messi, right? And then any outputs we have will be branded differently. Here's the thing: as I've over the last year or so, I realized. So I started following you. You've given me a great break on getting my social media accounts going and stuff like that. So I was really trying to cater to the academic community, but I realized there's a whole community of normies out there that can utilize this for a monetary gain on my part. Thank you. And there's that whole other world where it's not just, as Mike was saying, academic eggheads. And I'm starting I want to fit where I feel comfortable, right? And so there's a lot of people out there that are interested in how the financial markets work. How does the macro economy work? How does a firm work, right? There's a lot of people that just have that interest. And I want to be able to speak to them and give them something more than anything than to write a paper for an echo chamber of people that won't actually do anything in the markets in their life.
But the thing I want to see is you're winning. See, the fact that you look at a DSG model and what you're saying about their inflation forecasts, they always impose return to equilibrium on their future expectations. You've got a dynamic system with feedbacks, which generates, complex nonlinear interactions. And I want to crash those bastards out of the planet. And to some extent, having a record saying, here's our forecast versus the Federal Reserve's DSGE model. That's the sort of paper I want to see. And I want to see you guys beat them in the marketplace as well, because nobody'd pay for the forecast of the Federal Reserve in trying to, pick the stock market. But you guys are now trying to pick the stock market as well.
Yeah, so our latest module now is an S&P 500 module. We have our thesis on what drives the market. And so for one, without giving away too much, because this is institutional stuff that we sell, not even to our retail clients, we have surmised and I think proved that ultimately markets are fundamentally driven. They're just lagged. Okay, so what we had to do in our model is we had to somehow develop forward expectations. Well, how do you do that in a determined system dynamic model? So we had to trace back our feedback loops, right? Going through each system state to eliminate the lags that we were seeing. Because like when we just plotted, the net equity in firms in the financial sector, it was shaping right. The rate of change looked pretty good if we measured against real world data, but it was lagged about a year. Well, how do you get rid of a lag in a determined model? Well, you got to trace those feedback loops back. Where are the flows? I wish I could like turn off this chat pop up. Does the chat pop up in front of your screen, guys? Or is that just
It's
a
popping
me
up to the
problem?
right-hand side of mine.
Oh, I got
On
it.
the right. It's popping up in front of your screen.
It drives me. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So modeling expectations is a very, very, very important aspect of economics, macroeconomics, and figuring out how to do that is tricky business. AI is probably going to be involved in the future, but if you model, as most economists do, expectations with an adaptive expectation structure, which goes back to Bill Phillips of the Phillips curve and the Phillips machine, writing it on an envelope he pulled out of his pocket while sitting on a park bench in London talking to Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman asked Phillips, on behalf of his student, PhD student Phil Kagan, how would you model expected inflation? And Phillips wrote out essentially what we know today as adaptive expectations. And Friedman popularized it with his 1968 presidential address to the American Economics Association, long run, short run, Phillips curve. And it's in most economics models, macro and micro. And if you study dynamic modeling, what you'll find out is that an adaptive expectation structure does a nice job under many circumstances, but in other circumstances, it will give you steady state error, which is very bad in a dynamic system. So we have addressed this in system dynamics, and we have expectation structures that we use that are consistent with Kahneman and Tversky's anchoring and adjustment, and don't have steady state error and what have you. So getting ahead, and by the way, it's not rational expectation. We can model rational expectations as well. It is very different. But getting a handle on that, because a lot of economic decision making is not made on the basis of what is or what is perceived to be, but is what is expected to be in the future, right? And so I think the macro models of the future will be AI based. They'll have some kind of, mimicking of whatever neuroscientists tell us people do when they form their expectations. But until we get there, we do have some solutions in system dynamics that are pretty robust. And when we do have data on human expectations, which is not all that common, but when we do have it, it can mimic the data fairly nicely.
Yeah. So Dave, are you okay? I just wanted to make sure no family deaths or anything crazy like that. You're just
nothing like that.
Not working.
While we were talking, prices on my internet went up. I couldn't afford it, so so my internet crashed because
bad internet to death in the family. It's like, whoa!
Know, right? Things escalate.
Depends on who dies, really.
Yeah. It's that time of year. People just freeze to death in England, like solid. Haven't you seen The Day After Tomorrow? I mean, they just, that's what's happening. That's what it feels like right now. I cannot warm this place up. I've got it on full blast and it won't warm up.
I did notice.
No,
yeah, what's you
I know, I normally got my
pensioner,
t-shirt
right?
on,
You're
right?
not one of the pensioners going to die to save the budget in the UK.
What's that?
You're not one of the pensioners going to die to save the budget in the UK.
No, thanks, Steve. I'm not yet a pensioner, but nice of you to suggest.
I'm going to be.
Have I not got enough Clinique on? Am I looking, like I'm ready for my pension?
You look like you're freezing.
Yeah,
So
it is kind
you are freezing.
It's just funny because the studio's huge space, my studio for work, and I've got I crank up the heater, but unless I get here an hour and a half beforehand, it just won't ever heat up. Now it's just getting there, just about. I might get back to the t-shirt.
Since I'll be in London in 3 days, what clothes should I pack? How cold
All
is
of
it
them.
there?
Actually, we should meet up. Dave.
Yeah, 100%.
Mike and I are going to be in London.
Royal
How long are you in London? Sorry.
We're going to be staying at the Royal Horse Guards.
So the Savoy. I mean, yeah, I can meet you there as long as you're buying.
It's the Royal Horseman or whatever it's called. The story is
Royal Horse Guards.
Yeah, the
Royal
story is
Horse
we
Guard.
have one of our another energy modeling colleagues, and actually for Tony's benefit, we're getting together everybody who's modeling effectively on energy and economics to work out what should be the proper way to model energy in the capitalist system. That's the intention of the workshop. So we are taking it seriously. That it's clearly economists have never done that before properly. That's why we're there. But the bloke is being organized by Kerry King. And Kerry has written a model called Harmoney, Harmoney. And when I was in Austin, what I was doing with Kerry is porting his model across to Ravel, which we've done. Now, we haven't yet done the matrix mathematics he'd like to have as part of that, the tensor mathematics. I still want to do that. I just wanted to get it working in Ravel without changing the structure too much. So we managed to get that done. Anyway, Kerry, a benefactor, has discovered
Steve,
Kerry.
Real quick, Steve. Einstein himself had problems with tensors, so
Yeah, I know. Anyway,
no pressure.
So Kerry's got himself a very wealthy benefactor, and the first meeting we had, which you weren't at, Mike, was in Montreux in Switzerland. And it was one of the best hotels I've ever stayed in, with magnificent views over the Lake Geneva and just quite a spectacular location. And it's because the benefactor likes to stay in good hotels, and he comes along with us. So the benefactor actually takes his ideas seriously, but he ain't going to slum it in the 4-star. Thanks very much. So we're having these meetings about energy with some impoverished academics in some of the wealthiest hotels in the world. And this is the second one. And the Royal Horsemen's or the Royal something or other. Sorry?
Royal Horse Guards.
Well, you're right on Pall Mall by the sounds of it.
Yeah, that's where we are.
Right. Well, it doesn't get any posher than that.
Dave, come along and meet us up there. We'll put it on the benefactors tab for whatever scotch you decide to buy.
Perfect. I'll wear my best jandals, even in the middle of winter.
Yeah, I'll bring a horsewhip, whatever you like.
Okay.
Let's do the top chatters because it seems like we're at that point.
Let's do it. All right. Who is doing it this time? Do you think it's my turn? I mean,
probably your turn. Yeah, so. Before you're
I normally pull rank as the host and get out of it, but I think it's probably my time. Yeah, Ghost on the Half Shell, Kevin Mays, Process Server, Tony Wilson, Web Freaks, Algorithm, The Herald of Change, Dreg Eye, Satosh Bala, Blue Bay, Michael Newman, Satosh Bala again, No One, Philip Brule, Garen Osborne, Marai, Tom Meow, Need to Be Regulated, HBB, Rick O'Brien, Sherry Wise, TR, Long Defiant, Jay Mills, Samir, Go to Guy, Steve Friths, Jan Watson, B. Bruce, Jack Fretwell, Young Visionary 1985, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Kathleen Logan Smith, Joe Polito, I'm running out of breath, Nicholas Gomez, Adam Childs, Bullet Quantum, Michael Anthony, Anna Ringwald, Red Dot, BZ, Helen Grives, David Collins, Paul Trainer BSC, and Ken Crawford. I've done it for another year. Now I can pull rank again for quite a while.
Just carry on with the energy theme, by the way. One person whose work that I want to spend more time with is Tim Garrett. Tim's a atmospheric physicist based in the University of Utah, and Tim is developing a thermodynamical model of capitalism. And one thing he argues, and it's a difficult argument to put into economic framework, but he argues inflation is going to occur because of a decline in the productivity of energy. Right? They have less capacity to produce output because we're putting more energy in to get energy out. That, he says, is going to cause inflation. And so he has a thermodynamic explanation for inflation. Now, whether we're going to see that in the data as economists measure inflation, I'm not really sure, but his expectations of the future are rising prices for basic inputs coming out of the decline in the energy return and energy invested. So that's another feasible angle on why we have inflation and why we might have to expect more in the future. What I'm expecting more likely is an economic breakdown where the only way to sustain the system is to go to rationing. And in that situation, the price calculation will become somewhat irrelevant. It's a case of, can you produce enough goods, basic goods, to keep people alive? But yeah, his explanation is actually a thermodynamic explanation for inflation.
So I think.
Sorry, Mike, go on.
not to tip my hand for this coming workshop we're going to have, but I think the key to climate change and this whole using energy in economic models and what have you boils down to, kind of how you conceptualize things. I think it's imperative that we think of the developing world and the developed world, right? And the developing world is not going to not use fossil fuels to continue developing and taking care of their children and what have you, because 100 years from now, there might be a global catastrophe. Those folks aren't worried about that.
10 and you might change your mathematics.
Even still, I just don't think that plays very well. So what you need is technology to develop an affordable alternative energy that can be used by, of course, the developed world and the developing world. And it can't be like, take the iPhone. The invention of the iPhone was revolutionary. The iPhone 16 to iPhone 17 to, that's evolutionary. That's just incremental improvements. We can't have that. You got to have a revolutionary, innovative technology that is affordable. Then you can be, it won't be using fossil fuels. You can be desalinating the ocean and providing fresh water, so on and so forth. And so I think the only thing that matters really is innovation. And then you get into, what spurs innovation. And once somebody invents a better mousetrap, under what circumstances is it adopted and it diffuses throughout the world? Let me give you one quick example. One of our alums from WPI is a guy by the name of Dean Kamen. And I've never ever heard of him. He's an inventor. He invented the Segway, that little scooter thing that people use. And he's invented lots of other things, but that's what he's most well known for. And he invented a water purification system. It's basically a box. And you can pour horribly dirty water in the top, wait a minute, and then go and drink it. And it's as pure. It could be used in surgery. It's so pure. And he said, when he first invented it, he said, if you put this box in every village in every developing nation in the country, you'd cure all of these diseases, all these problems. And he said, we have the technology. I have no idea how to get it into every village around the world. And so that gets you into economics and politics and regulation and psychology and how do you adopt it? How do you fix them? How do you, when they break down, if you need a new part, the whole 9 yards. Now, he has solved the problem since then. He's partnered with the Coca-Cola company. And because Coke, he said they're everywhere. So he's got a deal with them where they'll take this water purification thing on their routes with the Coca-Cola. But therein lies, we got to first invent the technology. And then once it's invented, you have to get it adopted throughout the world. And that, I think that's the key.
So this is Tim Garrett's model that Steve ported.
Okay. Hit the run.
Yeah, we just got to get rid of all this stuff here. I always like this little model that he's done. I shouldn't say little. There's actually you guys have a more expanded model file too. I just couldn't get it to run. I don't know what's happening here. So we've got inflation decay rate. What does that mean, Steve?
Well, it's look, that's a model. I actually built that model of Tim's model I think before the pandemic. So we're talking about 6 years ago. So it's quite some time since I've worked through the logic of it. But basically, you've got decarbonisation not occurring fast enough to stop increase in carbon dioxide levels, reducing productivity. And therefore, the reduction in productivity leads to a rise in the price per unit. Now, what I've got a feeling is you're not actually including the monetary system properly here. So it may well have a collapse of the monetary system as well, and you get deflation as economists would measure it. But this is basically talking about a breakdown. You can see global GDP and that's years since 2017 there. So you're talking about 20, 25 years in the future. the model predicting a breakdown of the global economic system. And you can now say atmospheric CO2 growth is slowing down because the productive facilities have collapsed as well. And global wealth reaches a peak and then falls over. So in its own way, this is a tiny version of the limits to growth based on thermodynamics rather than based on the idea of fixed stocks of resources being eliminated over time. Yeah.
Interesting.
Took me about an hour to put that model together. Of course, there was a huge amount of work by Tim to come up with the idea in the first place.
Now, stop me if I missed this while I was away, but energy and inflation, is there, which you've been talking about a little bit here, I wanted to expand on a bit more. Is there, based on just what Mike was hinting at there, let's say you do get a different energy mix going on, and it could be that it's incremental where we do end up with a mix of mandates or reduced energy use, or we end up with a much more advanced system of energy production like fusion, which is vaguely promised. I don't know if that's hype or not, but it seems like that's more of a possibility than it was 10 years ago. How much would that have changed things in the pandemic, for example? If we are in a situation where we've got incredibly cheap, clean energy, like fusion, let's say, or a much more advanced system where we've got way more solar and renewables, better battery storage or something, does lower energy prices that are clean change the equation much here, or is there something else going on with inflation that's separate from that?
It does, but the question is how fast can you put the machinery in place?
Yeah,
I mean, the analogy about that, the guy with the water purifier,
yeah.
Okay, so making a prototype is one thing. Making a production version is yet another. Getting it distributed to people who are going to get the bars is the third factor again. So this sort of technology could take, the usual market rate diffusion could take 10 to 20 years to diffuse through the system before you can actually reverse the problem you're experiencing. But fundamentally, energy is you can do a Koleskian price decomposition around energy rather than around labor. Because the basic idea that Koleski is working with is that you've got firms who have to buy some inputs from an external source. So there aren't factories turning out humans yet, nor are there factories turning out energy, because energy is not something we produce, it's something we find in the universe and we then deplete it in various ways. But you could have an energy-based system, the same sort of the markup on energy, and then what you've got, your productivity term is not output per worker, but output per energy unit input. Now that starts to fall. If you have a declining energy return and energy invested, you're going to get inflation out of that. That comes back and supports the arguments that Tim was making about inflation being a consequence of declining energy productivity, because we've depleted most of the very incredibly dense and very cheap fossil fuel energy. Now it's still very dense, but we've got to put a lot more energy in to get it out. If we could get to the stage of another energy source, when I think fission is more likely than fusion. But if you had the type of productivity people are talking about out of fission systems, without the private financing costs that make it impossible, and without the regulatory delays, you might therefore get declining inflation out of that and a sustainable economy. But my feeling is, Mike said 100 years, I said 10. I think the amount of time we have to do these things is far more constrained than most of us realize, both in terms of energy and in terms of pollution.
Yeah, when I said 100 years, what I meant is that's kind of the conventional wisdom when the average citizen thinks about it. They think, oh, that's like 100 years from now.
That's right. Yeah.
Those who are well off say, I can afford to worry about it. Those who are struggling to survive, my point is, you can 10 years, 100 years, 50 years, they're like, I don't care. I got to feed my kids tomorrow.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mike, in the sense that culturally, we seem to want to ask people to do a lot of things in terms of how to respond to inflation, for example, how to respond to the energy mix and the climate crisis. But they're in, and this is why I've seen it for a long time, they're in a survival economy. They can't think of these things. And even people that we think are relatively well off are still in that mindset, and they're in the taxpayer myth, and there are all sorts of stories that they can't even have these sorts of conversations. And so I think that's a bigger barrier actually to whether or not this technology exists, like you say, Mike, with the box. I mean, there's a waterproof, we could do it, but you can't get the political will because people are thinking, well, how do I pay my mortgage off, or how do I get enough money to survive in retirement, and that kind of thing. And I think that's a bigger, sadder problem, that we don't even get to talk about these things in the mainstream because for whatever reason, the narratives are just not, people aren't available in the head to talk about them. So, which is sad, but that's where we're at.
Psychologists, behavioral economists, it's present bias. Why do people still smoke cigarettes? Well, 50 years from now, it might be a problem, but it's not a problem today. So it's very common.
Yeah, we have a better relationship with other people than we do with our future selves. We can't perceive a relationship with our future selves very easily at all. Not many people can. So yeah, that's well, the only positive thing about that is it's a cultural thing and can be changed. It's hard, but it's not physics. They're not hard problems to solve in the science realm. They're much more in the how do we create better stories and so on, which is the stuff I'm really interested in. So it's doable. Go ahead. Sorry,
another story that linked to this from one of my colleagues at WPI, a psychologist, and he studied. He went to school at the University of Colorado, and in the state of Colorado in the U.S. at the time he was doing this, because the terrain there is very, as you know, rocky and all that stuff. Radon gas is often a problem in people's cellars, basements. That it seeps up through the earth and it's poisonous, it's odorless, colorless. So the government said, okay, any citizen can have a free radon testing kit if they want it. And then you can put it out, it measures whether you have radon, it's a problem or not. You send it in for free, we'll do the testing and what have you. So you would think every citizen would say, oh my gosh, I'll get that free kit. No, only a small fraction of the population got the free kit. Of the people who got the free kit, only a small fraction of them actually put the thing out for like 2 weeks. It had to absorb whatever it absorbs. Of those people, only a small fraction bothered to send it in to see if they had a radon gas problem. And of the people who did, only a small fraction of them bothered to vent the radon gas. It's like, why is that? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it's people's risk assessment, right? A lot of people, that's why you eat fatty foods and smoke cigarettes. It's like, or drink alcohol. It's like, I don't see this as a problem, certainly not now, right? So when you're dealing with human beings who are not rational, Mr. Spock-like agents, and you have these issues, it is very, very hard to get substantial change absent, a big time crisis, a world war, an asteroid coming. Even in the movie Don't Look Up, the asteroid was coming to hit the earth and everybody was, oh. So we deal with human beings.
I'm reading over the break. I got into a book by Thomas Harris. He's the guy that wrote Fatherland, and he's written a fiction called The Second Sleep, and it's about a guy that you think you're reading a historical novel about the Middle Ages, and it turns out that no, it's just some guy living in England in what looks like the Middle Ages, but it's actually 600 years from now, and it's about his discovery of what the apocalypse kind of was. So it's very collapse narrative type thing, but it's really interesting, and it touches on a lot of things that you're talking about here. But also talks about the power of art, with this, again, my area, the power of story and why people didn't accept some of the narratives that were going on at the time before the apocalypse and so on. It's a really good read. It's I wouldn't say quite unputdownable because it's a little bit takes a while to get going, but it's very interesting. And is
that a book that started off with the priest being sent somewhere to do a?
Okay,
because I read the first chapter and I was quite captivated, but then I heard in the final chapter he sort of wipes everything out in the final chapter. The resolution is very poor. Is that true?
I haven't quite finished
it yet.
No, I am about a third of the way through. So I'm quite enjoying the trip, actually, as it were, the journey.
The opening was very good. I've explained why. Because what you have is this obvious discussion. It feels like a medieval. There's a pope or something at that level has to send somebody else to do a funeral for a priest in an outlying region, and he rides there on a horse and has to worry about being hit by raiders and marauders, and finally gets there and then finds the priest that has to do the a funeral for is a heretic because look at all the plastic he has.
Yeah, and the mobile phones.
And that just boom, because this is what the future world's going to be like. It's spoiler alert, I know, but it's that
happens pretty early on. That's really what the premise is. Yeah,
that's the first chapter. Yeah, so I think that's the future we're going to have if we survive. Then we're going to end up and like we're already seeing the seeds for it being laid in America right now. A religious, superstition-driven, reactive, anti-technology world. I think that's what we unfortunately face.
Look, potentially,
we've got a long way from inflation here, by the way, but still,
we have gone a long way from inflation. I think energy is definitely related to it, though. That's why I wanted to. I don't know if there's anything more to unpack there. Just that I've always instinctively found, and I'm hoping to get some guidance here. I've always instinctively found that energy was the core thing when it comes to inflation, much more than any other phenomenon. And if you could control the cost of that down to, too cheap to meter kind of thing, then you change the economy completely, and it's clean, obviously.
It would, but the too cheap to meter has been, a fallacy for far too long, unfortunately. Fossil fuels were too cheap to meter.
Oh, I see. Right. So it didn't change the underlying inflation.
Well, it changed. It didn't change inflation, but it changed the dynamic of the economy, because you were getting like the energy return and energy invested back when oil was first discovered was of the order of 100 or 200 to 1. But of course, the technology we have at that stage was far more primitive than we have now. Now we're getting, we're down to the sort of 20 to 1, 25 to 1 level, and maybe lower. And there's good arguments you can't get below 10, otherwise you can't have a advanced economy. But the energy we can extract is that much greater. We still waste a large amount, as Tony's been saying in the chats. But energy, what we fundamentally have, and you look at the GDP and look at energy consumption, what GDP really is energy turned into useful work. To a first approximation, GDP is energy, as we find it in the raw environment, turned into something useful for us. So energy availability is absolutely critical to having an advanced civilization. And we've been taking that for granted, not in factoring in it at all. And I think we're going to be forced to factor in it over the next decade.
Agree. One way or the other. It certainly seems like it. I better give our host, our sponsor, Planksip, a plug here, I think. As a philosophy and culture media outlet, Planksip helps emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. And Steve, do you want to just remind people about your Substack and what they can expect?
Two sites. I've got patreon.com/ProfSteveKeen and profstevekeen.substack.com. That's where I put almost all my posts up. I'm not putting out a lot of material right now because I'm trying to write 3 books at once. So I haven't put many posts up recently, but most of my posts there are free. If people want to get my ideas out rather than pay for them, rather than behind a paywall. But obviously the more people who support me, the more I can get out to people who are, in the public. So patreon.com/ProfSteveKeen and profstevekeen.substack.com.
So you're writing, Steve, you're writing 2 econ books and a romance novel, huh?
Romance. I'm a bit old for romance, mate.
Now, we've been nudged, just as Steve was saying as well, but by one of our commentators as well, to get back to greedflation. What have we missed in our greedflation talk about? So what is everyone's feeling now, having heard each other chat about it? The most important takeaways that we can just make sure we're clear about. So it seems that if I roughly summarize, that it's given the nature of things, it's the way that the business cycle works. It's going to happen. The pandemic was a particular shock that revealed the nature of it more clearly than before, but that it also shows the power of unions have stopped us having the ability to control wage growth much. So there's not enough fight in the system. Is that about right, or is there something more to it we've missed?
It is, but Jay's just thrown in a very good point here. Put Jay's comment up a moment ago about controlling inflation of rents and home prices. and this comes back to some of Blair Fix's work on the role of inflation as well. He said it's not that things have got more expensive in consumption goods. It's housing has got more expensive. Housing prices have been driven by a level of private debt. And that's what's been squeezing people's capacity, not just to consume, but also to be able to afford to have a house where they're limited to rent or buy. And the inflation in house prices has definitely been caused by the financial system lending too much money for mortgages. That's what's actually caused that huge inflation in house prices. So the real reason this inflation has mattered so much to people versus what happened back in the 70s is back in the 70s you could still afford to buy a house. Okay, and you could afford to pay the rent. Now, with the housing and rent being unaffordable, a tiny increase in consumer prices wipes you out completely. And that's what I think we saw the greedflation narrative coming forward, because that was criticizing the corporations and saying us workers are getting screwed. And it's more obvious now because house prices in real terms are something like 3 or 4 times what they were back in the 1970s.
So,
yeah, go on. Sorry.
My takeaways stemming from my modeling are this. There's sort of 2 sectors in the economy, the price takers and the price makers. This goes back to Gardner Means in the 1920s and 30s, all the way to John Kenneth Galbraith and institutional economists today, probably post-Keynesians as well. So some of my high school classmates, I'm from Wisconsin, Badgers, were farm kids, dairy farm kids, and the price of milk, they didn't set it. It was given to them, and they could sell their milk at that price, period, end of discussion. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the price makers. So they have some sort of economic power. They might have patents, network effects, whatever. They have a moat, right? So how do they set prices? Koletsky was right. Steve and Ty are right. They have a markup over their unit costs, and they play with the markup. So what causes inflation? Is it, greed? They're marking it up to, extract windfall profits or whatever. Well, it depends. There's a lot going on, right? It's their competitor prices versus their prices. It's their costs. Do they have a union that can make them pay? Do they have supply constraints? Is there a sudden surge in demand because the government's given out checks during the pandemic? Then is it expected or not? And that goes into wage demands and what have you. So there's a whole lot of stuff happening here that, what causes inflation? Well, it's a lot of it is the markup, and the firms play with the markup both up and down depending on what's going on. So it's a very complicated question, and simplistic answers, media and whatever, I don't think are, it's all inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It can be, but that's certainly not the only thing.
But those caricatures are much easier to explain and to get people hooked into. And I think that's where the nuance gets lost. People don't want to understand it in great detail. It's much easier to blame big bad corporations on one side, or the other side is, I guess, it's a market, and you should have self-responsibility and find other ways to get cheaper goods, etc. So I always find those caricatures not useful.
One thing I didn't mention, I don't think anybody has, is, well, if what I've just characterized and Ty has characterized and Steve is true, then what do you do about it? And the standard solution policy is, well, let the central bank raise interest rates when there's inflation. Yeah. And the post-Keynesians have come up with lots of other alternatives. Employer of last resort programs, essentially a buffer stock program for labor, because wages are the biggest component of all of this. Alba Lerner and Dave Colander had a market anti-inflation policy where you buy credits, kind of like carbon credits, but you buy credits to raise prices. So there are clever solutions that have been proposed by some economists, mostly post-Keynesians, that have accepted the Koletsky, Gardner Means, Steve Keen, Ty Keen's view that the markup is of firms with market power is one of the big contributors to all of this. And then how do you combat it? And just using the hammer of interest rates is maybe not the way to go, or not always the way to go.
But it does have a role, you think, Mike? I can't see it. I've
Well,
assumed that it has no role whatsoever.
I mean,
that's
Murder
relevant.
would say, you know, the difference between a bond and a dollar bill is one is an interest-bearing IOU and the other isn't, and that it should be set at whatever policymakers think the rate of interest should be. It's probably should be low rather than high, but I'll defer to Steve on this, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, there's the whole idea that interest rates can control inflation comes out of a neoclassical model where they believe they're modifying people's future expectations. That's the basis of seeing interest rates as the control mechanism. And it's not. I mean, it just doesn't work in the real world like that unless you put rates up so much that you destroy aggregate demand. And that's what happened during under the Volcker interest rate rises. The increase interest rate cost was so great that you crushed credit-based demand, you crushed the trade unions' bargaining power as well, and you caused a recession. Okay, and that's what, and also, of course, we can't forget the effect of China coming on as a production mechanism. Again, not much long after that, China started turning up in production stats in the mid 90s. So you had, but it started in the early 80s that they started putting free trade zones together. So you had all these inflations giving us a fall in inflation. But the idea that you're fine-tuning inflationary expectation using interest rates is still why you get those nonsense predictions out of the DSG models of the Fed and the Treasury. And they're modeling a mythical world. And in their mythical world, interest rates control inflationary expectations control inflation. It just doesn't work that way. What they're doing is crushing the economy if they put them up high enough, or just redistributing wealth towards those who own bonds if they're not putting up them high enough to crush the economy.
So generally, you can stop a car that's speeding by just smashing into a brick wall. Brilliant if the Volkswagen way, but yeah.
Real quick, from a feedback point of view, the policies that I was mentioning ago are installing negative feedback loop systems where they currently do not exist. Because negative loops, like a thermostat, control systems are stabilized systems, in this case, the price level. If you want to use a systems point of view.
Yeah. So inflation, so when it comes to greedflation, at least, the solution of the interest rates, just to clarify that, there is a problem, I think, with the way that it was seen to be a soft landing, that you've got a continuation of that stupid narrative now, because it seemed to be, oh, look, if we just get the inflation rate right, well, it was absolutely nothing to do with it. I think that annoys me, to be honest with you.
Like, again, they've got a model which leaves out the neoclassical model leaves out stocks. This is one thing we haven't discussed so far in the conversation at the moment, but they have a model in which you get the flows right, everything is fine. They don't have accumulated stocks of levels of private debt determining economic performance, and so they think inflation, or you get inflation of 2% and everything's going to be hunky-dory. No, when you've got a private debt level 170% versus 50% two generations earlier, you have a totally different income distribution situation coming out of that. So they don't have the stocks in the system that let them look at the feedbacks which we're talking about that can amplify or dampen these phenomena.
What's interesting is my colleagues in system dynamics who are not economists, who came to system dynamics originally through electrical engineering, Forrester, or through management, but they're not trained as economists, would always tell me, you economists don't know about stocks and flows. And the ironic thing is, Irving Fisher wrote a famous paper in 1896 where he educated, 1896, not 1996, where he educated the economics profession about stocks and flows. He defined them, explained them, and whatever. So economists have been familiar with stocks and flows since the 19th century.
But only the minority economist, mate. Even like Fisher, when he did that, he was mainstream, obviously, but he's been ignored. So the stock and flow obsessives, they could be like you and me and Ty, and the post-Keynesians in general, not the neoclassicals.
Yeah. Well, my point is, and if you read the literature going in the 1940s, they talk about it. So they're aware of it. I mean, Kenneth Boulding wrote a book in 1950 trying to recast economics around the balance sheet, stocks, right?
Yeah.
But even economists who are aware of the stock flow concept, because it's not the words stock and flow are in the econ literature everywhere. They don't understand the importance of stocks and flows. They don't get it. They kind of use the words, but they don't understand that stocks create delays. Stocks represent the state of the system. Stocks are the accumulation, the integration of flows, which causes dynamics. Nature integrates. That's why we have change over time, stocks and flows. They don't understand that because they're not trained from a systems point of view.
So all things being equal, if we had another greedflation scenario, and by the way, this would be, I reckon, a non-story if people felt supported by the economy in other means. And let's say, I mean, I'm not 100% behind a job guarantee personally, but I get the idea of it. I'd like to see it implemented and tweaked with it to some level, or a UBI or something else, right? Or a better welfare system, more reliable one. People wouldn't, I don't know if greedflation would be as much of a story as it is. Do you know what I mean? Like the basic support mechanisms of the economy that once existed don't feel like they're there for most people.
And that goes back to the housing issue at the moment too.
Yeah.
We're talking, like Forrester always told us, what you're trying to do with modeling, at least from his point of view, was redesign the airplane. The airplane isn't, we want it to fly faster, higher, more fuel efficiently, carry more cargo, quieter, whatever, right? And you have to redesign it so it performs better. And so redesigning it might be installing a particular UBI or whatever. It requires modeling. What are the implications of adding another engine to the airplane or changing the ailerons or whatever, right? Don't just do it. Model it, and let's see long-term and short-term, because often in the short run you get what you want, and then the system adjusts and you get worse after better in the longer run, and vice versa. So lots of good ideas, but they require dynamic modeling.
I might go to Ghost's comment here about no discussion of oligarchy and antitrust too, before we close.
Well, I did try bringing it up.
Well, I've experienced oligarchy pricing. I got the choice of putting up my prices on Patreon by 30% or taking a 30% cut in what I got out of consumers, because Apple, not Patreon, is taking 30% now of all fees for Patreon. That's just decided. That's oligarchy. That is what Yanis Varoufakis called techno-feudalism coming in. That certainly is the case where oligarchy
Apple is cash
matters.
poor. They need the money.
Oh, they're the poor people, poor starving apples. Yeah.
I mean,
I think it's time for rotten apple. We need rotten apple with a worm coming out of the apple. We need to get that popularized. Okay. But there's so much of that stuff was distorted by neoclassical theory that basically said monopolies set higher prices based on their theory, and the theory is fucking wrong. It doesn't describe the real world. So the argument that monopolies cause higher prices is built on a neoclassical framework that I want to get rid of, which is one reason I don't talk about it. But the oligarchy stuff, the techno-feudalism, a company like Apple being able to put its hand into my pocket and take out 30% of my salary, yes, that's definitely oligarchical behavior.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you cleared that up, because that was my question earlier on. I wasn't sure what the angle you guys thought was. And so, I mean, Denise Hearn, I remember now talking about 2% of Apple's profits in 2022, if I've got this right. It was very close to this or something. It was 2 or 3%, were from the forcing Google to pay them, basically forcing Google to pay them to be on the Apple devices as the default search program. So if that's not oligopolies, just renting, then I don't know what is. So it is definitely a factor. Now, so Ty, can I bring you back in for a sec here before we go? So if greedflation came around again tomorrow, in the sense that if you had enough awareness of what happened the last time around and know it's cyclical, should you just chill and just wait and just ride it out if you can? I mean, how should someone approach it psychologically if it was to happen again?
So the analogy here is the cancer, the patient got cancer and we gave the patient chemotherapy and the patient lost his hair, but he survived. The economy got a pandemic. Our chemotherapy was lockdowns and shutting down the economy. Losing the hair was inflation. but we survived. And there is nothing, this is my opinion, there is nothing we could have done about it. We shut down, 20% of the economy. There were going to be negative feedbacks that came out of that. And no amount of policy for a specific incident in history is going to change that. It is what it is. And that's where I stand on it. We've come through on it. If we bring up a chart, ultimately, if you want perspective, right, is we kind of always want the blue and the green lines to be above the red line. And generally we are, but there are points where there's exogenous shocks that happen, on our planet that affect, our economic system. And there are periods where things aren't good. And if you look at the pandemic and that huge spike in inflation, it wasn't good for people. Their wages weren't rising as fast as prices. But there's very little you can do about that when you shut down 20% of the economy for 3 to 6 months. So no, turn off.
I thought that's where we're going to leave it this week. It's just stuck with that in the middle of the screen. Yeah. Well, look, I think we've done a good roundup at the end there, and I think people should be happy with that. I hope you are, guys. I hope you've enjoyed listening to us. And welcome to 2025. I think there's going to be a lot to talk about this year. So I will send us off for now. Take care. Be nice. Look after yourself. Remember to brush your teeth. Visit your mum and hit subscribe and the bell so you know when we're going live next week. But for now, it's goodbye from Steve Keen and friends.